So this week, in week 8 of the Introduction to Business course here in SILS in Waseda University, we're talking about branding. And this presentation provides an overview, and there are also several supplementary presentations that I will be giving on particular issues such as brand extension and talking about particular artifacts of effective branding that will give some insight into how one can project authenticity and emotional engagement to consumers. So, the first thing we ought to do is actually give some consideration to what we actually mean by marketing, because marketing is often criticized. It's often seen as just a set of tricky endeavors to try and sell a product to people who may not buy it otherwise or may not want to pay the price that you would like people to pay. But let's engage with what's really understood by marketing, because it's a far more comprehensive notion. In fact, it's become such an expansive notion in business that to some degree it's eating into, cannibalizing even other disciplinary areas within business practice. And then we'll see also there are fundamental questions about what is the relationship between our understanding of branding, which is our topic, and marketing. So we can think of marketing in the narrow sense, first of all, the popular but rather too limited sense, as just a bunch of tools and techniques for selling, or as people would cynically say sometimes, upselling. But actually, the selling component is very important for businesses too, and any successful business must have this sorted out. You have to think about, well, first of all, how you're actually going to get your product to the customer in the first place. Put it in front of your customer, either in terms of the messaging or the physical presentation of the product, the actual getting the product to the consumer before a sale is made, or after a sale if you've engaged the customers online and then you need to distribute it. That's the easy bit, fundamentally. When you have to put your product through various distribution channels, and those distribution channels can have an impact on the very perception of the product and therefore consumers' preparedness to pay a certain price, then these are some pretty important strategic issues. Also, of course, if you're dependent upon third parties to distribute your product, typically the shopkeeper or wholesalers, a whole bunch of people can be involved in the chain of distribution of a product, then your profitability is going to be diminished, because everyone, of course, wants their margin as well for handling your product. And so direct selling is the ideal if you actually can do it, if you can get people to commit to selling online and then just pay a small cost for direct shipping. But then, of course, it opens up so many other challenges of getting consumers to find your product in the first place. So the communications function, the distribution function, and actually getting people to commit to the product, quite aside from the persuasive elements of that, the most fundamental issues of getting your pricing right. One has to price with a view to your competition, but also a view very much to how customers perceive the total value of your own product. And so understanding the consumer's sense of the value proposition that you represent to them, not just to strategically try and enhance that, but to try and optimize the pricing so that, in a sense, you don't leave money on the table, that if consumers are prepared to pay more, you get them to pay more, is a significant part of marketing. And of course, a lot of that involves research. It involves understanding your customers and your potential customers. And so a significant component of what we understand as the growing field of marketing is around marketing intelligence. So we're talking about fundamentally information and making sense of information, turning it into knowledge, actionable knowledge, gaining insight into the customer, their values, and that will therefore inform both tactical decisions, short term, about what your pricing should be, for example, and where you should sell your product, and then longer term strategic decisions about what actual kinds of products you should be putting in the market, what potential customer segments should you be chasing, and we'll talk further about that in a moment. Of course, the process of digitization presents new communications opportunities, new selling opportunities, but it also presents very significant informational opportunities too. We have unprecedented capability to identify particular consumers' values through the messages they send, the things they like, for example, through social media, through information they may choose to share themselves. And so much information at hand in digital form about our own sales, the most elementary things, for example, in the supermarket, of what things are bought together at what time, and ideally if you can get people to sign up to a loyalty card, for example, where they give you some information about themselves, and then the details of their payment, and even linking it to a particular kind of payment identity as well, allows the possibility to create profiles of customers and get deep insights into consumer behavior, and that could potentially grow your customer base, or even if the customer base stays constant, to get better pricing, for example. So digitization and the wealth of information that's out there has led to a huge array of new ventures, new applications to try and gain market intelligence and customer insight through digital means. And everyone involved in processes of selling, in business services and advertising and whatnot, are all talking the language of digital and digital transformation. Now, the classic marketing framework is much broader, obviously, than just this notion of selling. And as I've just said, selling, of course, is very important. But it does start with this basic premise. Well, what actually are we going to sell, and particularly to what particular customers? So one way of getting at this in classic marketing framework was the notion of the 4 Ps. Product, what are they going to sell? Price, for how much? Place, where are you going to sell it? And promotion, how are you going to sell it? How are you going to promote it, getting it to the customer in the first place? So branding is obviously a key part and a consequence of this decision set. It's about promotion, but it's more than that. Product development and the ongoing iterative dynamics of this, of putting products in the marketplace, of finding what resonates with customers, what doesn't, what aspects of your own character, origins as a company are more likely to engage customers in the first place. In short, what is your own DNA, as it were, as a business? Where are you coming from, and how is that valued or not valued by customers? All of these things will feed into the development projection of your own brand identity. So when we think about marketing, we can see that obviously a lot of professionals and academic stakeholders as well, such as the American Marketing Association, have given a lot of thought to how we actually define marketing. And we've got a couple of definitions here as well. They can become very expansive. For example, the American Marketing Association here speaks of the activity, set of institutions and processes for creating, communicating, delivering and exchanging offerings that have value for customers, clients, partners and society at large. Now, that's a very expansive definition when we start to talk about the set of institutions. That's all the firm and all the stakeholders, whether it's advertising agencies, market researchers, everyone involved in effectively developing products as well, too. So the designers and whatnot as well. So it's probably too broad a definition. An academic field obviously likes to have expansive horizons. That's understandable. So we're going to stay a little bit more focused on branding and a subset of the issues with marketing here. But we also need to note too that branding can seem rather narrow, but branding can seem even more comprehensive, even larger. And particularly when we start to think of it as a managerial challenge. And if we look at these slides here, the third point I've got, where we say branding can become very wide in scope if it includes the managerial challenge of aligning a firm or organization's practice with its own self-narrative and product. That is, becoming what you say you are, okay? So you make claims about your product and your company to project value and to try and drive customer emotional engagement, attachment to your brand, And then to make sure you actually deliver on that promise. That the functional product promises of the products, which means that there's a lot of technical engineering, design obligations to be continuing innovating your product to make sure that it delivers as you promise, and a lot of basic production quality control requirement issues there. But then also that your values, and presumably we are projecting some decent values if we want people to engage with us emotionally as a company, that those values are not undermined by poor conduct or just mismanagement of the enterprise itself. So being what you say you are is actually quite a challenge for an enterprise, just like it's a challenge for us as individuals. So I don't think we want to fall into a too expansive notion. Of course, we, under the rubric of or the rationale of branding, to talk about constantly remaking a company, for example, that means that we can succumb to some fuzzy thinking. But at the same time, I think it is very worthwhile to focus on what I say here in this final highlighted point, that managers must make sure that the firm is true to its brand story in all aspects of what it does. So this becomes a good decision rule when companies might be tempted to cut costs in wrong ways, to take shortcuts, for example, that would be inconsistent with, at odds with, the kind of values they're communicating to customers. So let's step back and talk more generally about the role of brands, okay? How do brands actually function? How do they function psychologically? What kind of value do they add to society? Because that notion of marketing as just some kind of cheeky or irresponsible way of just upselling things to people, and there's been a narrative about this, that the branding society is all about creating artificial wants and trapping people in an endless cycle of desires. Consume, consume, consume. We've heard all these narratives. Sometimes this comes from environmental activists. Sometimes it comes from anti-capitalist critics, for example. People like famous writers in the past, like Naomi Klein, for example, were asserting that brands effectively were giving people false or needless desires, trapping them in this culture of consumption. Now, even if there's some truth in this, it's easy to overlook the very important roles, functional roles, that brands represent in society, and indeed the way that actually brands can help society evolve in interesting ways. One of the critical things that a brand does, if we think about the role of an individual, say, artist's or designer's name, or a writer's name, for example, that effectively functions as a brand. What the brand does there is it very often allows innovation. One of the biggest barriers to innovation is actually just audience resistance. An artist wants to do something new. A designer has a completely different approach, for example. Maybe there's some new materiality, new technical solutions available, but we tend to be cautious in general. Consumers, audiences, particularly in, say, the cultural industries, are very cautious. So we're comfortable with the familiar. But, for example, the realm of the arts and designers is often to confront us with new solutions to old problems, or to bring new problems to our attention. So if we develop a certain faith in the vision of a designer or an artist or a company or whatever, then that brand that they represent us can lead us to another place, okay, to a positive place. Murakami Haruki, the writer, for example, he won a lot of new fans with his book Norwegian Wood, and then that led them to read other things by him. They went to a place where they probably wouldn't have gone otherwise in terms of literature, because some of his work is much more challenging, much less approachable, for example. Tom Ford, it's been said that Tom Ford made, when he was creative director at Gucci, that he made brown fashionable again, because he did some innovative things in terms of the visual language of Gucci, and shifted the culture. Limoa suitcases, for example. It's precisely because Limour had such a strong reputation for literally strong, robust luggage that they could be a pioneer in introducing lightweight polycarbonate suitcases with zips, for example. And the very fact that their brand was associated with reliability effectively allowed consumers to move to embrace a new technology that they might not have considered otherwise. And so, what's happening? Brands are offering assurance. They're offering assurance and they're offering identity. And both of those things are very important. Fundamentally, too, brands also just simplify consumer decisions. Okay? If you're in a hurry to buy something, if money is less scarce for you than time is, and that's very often the case, if you have to make a decision quickly, you'll grab the product from the brand that you already know, that you have a significant degree of trust in. Okay? And of course, universities benefit enormously from this. You know, Waseda University, its brand is absolutely critical to all we do. It is enabling. A benefit for me in being a faculty member at Waseda is it helps me to get through doors to talk to people that I wouldn't do otherwise. I can bask to some degree in the reflected glory of the Waseda brand. And one hopes then that the university is selective in who they allow to be associated with that brand, and so it actually strengthens the brand, and then it becomes a mutually reinforcing dynamic. So in normal consumer markets, what happens is that effectively brands help to reduce search costs and decision times. And the more complex the product, the more this is the case. Psychologically, what also happens here is that brands are shifting responsibility from the consumers in some sense. As I say here, you know, you buy a Toyota because you place a premium on a reliable car. And this is where I grew up in Australia, great distances out in the country, for example. A reliable car is a fundamental thing. When you're 100 kilometers away from the next town, in the days before mobile phones, 200 kilometers away from a public phone, the last thing you want to do is break down. Okay, so Toyota became the best-selling car for people in remote areas, particularly the seemingly indestructible Toyota Hilux, for example, is still the go-to vehicle, for example, in the mining industry, because it is just so fundamentally associated with reliability. So people not being able to ascertain before they buy the product, is this a reliable car or not, the Toyota brand will give them very significant assurance. Okay? We all understand, of course, that brands can enhance your status. That's what so much Lux is about. A lot of people who consume luxury products that make a big display of their own brandedness, okay, because there are some that are not. There are some Lux products that they're very discreet, and only the truly discerning can recognize them, and the real selling proposition is maybe not a stylistic factor, but maybe they're profoundly high quality. So people might discern high quality, but they're not quite sure what the brand is. That's separate. For many brands, they literally shout what they are. Okay, and brands that, even if they were very storied in terms of their creativity, have often been reduced now to the brand in itself as a sign of status. There's a lot of people getting around with Balenciaga, you know, baseball caps with just the white font on the black background, for example, or Supreme. Supreme is kind of like famous for being famous fundamentally, and stickers that you can put on everything. So supremely kind of everywhere. Okay. So brands are enhancing the status of their customers in this sense, but of course that only works for other people who value that brand. There may be some people who have Supreme allergy. You know, they see Supreme everywhere, and so they're kind of not Supreme. In the snowboarding industry, for example, there is the anything but Burton effect, because Burton has been so prominent in the snowboarding industry that there are lots of people who, you know, don't want to be seen kind of as head to toe Burton, even if the product is good. So they're very often contrarian. Just as there are some people who are quite contrarian and don't want to have an Apple phone, for example, precisely because so many people have an iPhone. But we know that everything is branded, almost everything is branded these days, okay? You'll find them in so many places. Components are increasingly branded. This is a skateboard, okay? And so the wheels are branded, the mountings are branded. You look at a snowboard, your bindings are separate. Your bindings are bought separately, so they're separately branded, for example. And even various parts of a product you might buy are separately branded, or they might embody several distinctive brands. You may buy outdoor wear, for example, which is co-branded with Gore-Tex or YKK or some other brand which speaks to attributes, robust zips, and the waterproofness of the fabric that's used, for example, as well as the brand of the product itself. So brands very much embody and express values, and more companies try and explicitly develop narratives around the origins of their brands, try and project certain values. They don't try and be everything to everybody. They want a clear value proposition that hopefully a proportion of the market will deeply engage with. For example, in the car industry, to have 5% market share is to be a very successful car company. If you were to nudge up to, say, 8% market share, you would be one of the most successful car companies in the world. So it's not that everyone has to want your product, love your product. You want only maybe 1 in 10 people to desire to own your car, your particular brand, and 1 in 8 to actually go through with the purchase and to feel very positive about it and to share their positivity with others so that you can keep 8% of the market, for example. So one of the things we can think about is when we're looking about jumping into a market or making sense of an existing market, one of the things we have to do is to engage with what all the existing brands in the market stand for in terms of values, and to then ask ourselves, are there other customers in the market who value potentially other things that are not being currently served? So to some degree, you can think of your positioning in the market in terms of your relative values positioning as much as anything else. Of course, some markets are characterized purely by functionality, and so values don't particularly matter at all. But I think another thing that people tend to overlook is that brands are not just speaking to immediate customers. Brands are as much a story about yourself, what you do and what you don't do, okay? What you won't compromise on, and to remind you to stay focused, okay? To not get distracted. Because one of the challenges is when you're out there in markets, you'll often get lots of new business leads. You'll see new potential. You could chase so many different business opportunities. And the great danger is you dissipate your energies. I think every student knows this. There are so many things you can be doing with your time as a student. There are so many clubs you can join. There are so many people who want to hire you in part-time jobs, for example. One of the great dangers having a part-time job as a student is you'll probably be a very valuable employee, and they'll be wanting to give you more and more hours and even try and turn you into a kind of a part-time manager, for example, of where you're working at the yakiniku restaurant or whatever. And so you actually have to be able to guard yourself and to say, no, my primary endeavor here is to be a hard studying, focused, motivated student, okay? So it's a lot of messaging to yourself, narrative about, well, what are we in this business for? What are our key goals? What's our strategy? What do we do? What don't we do? And so brands are telling stories to customers, to the manager of the firms, to all employees, to suppliers. So they guide strategic choice and implementation of strategy. So brands are core firm resources, okay? And obviously, reputation is built slowly and often expensively, but also damaged very easily. So another part of brands in terms of building it is ultimately brands function better if they have stories that are easily communicatable, that people can internalize, that people can associate with. Human beings are natural storytellers. Before humankind developed the capability of codifying text and all the rest of it, they were oral storytellers. And so much of transmission of knowledge from one generation to another on really basic things like sources of food and how to treat them and various dangers in communities and whatnot were part of oral storytelling. Human beings, their brains have evolved in this kind of way, to be easily drawn into stories and to recall stories and to tell stories. This is sort of why you get caught up binge watching streaming television, okay? Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever. Even if you know it's rubbish, even if you know it's kind of cheap, if it's not really a thing, you really want to find who killed who did it, okay? We are naturally inclined to be drawn into stories if they're persuasive stories. So what kind of stories? Well, tales of origins, place, cultural milieu out of which they come, about the founder. Too few companies actually personalize their brand story. But actually, naturally, of course, human beings are evolved from living in small-scale communities, and so forming an emotional affiliation or attachment to individuals and their individual story in terms of founding the business and maybe how then it manifests in attributes of the product, for example, or the service, makes you more likely to be engaged with that company, more likely to spend money on them. One of the clever things that app designers do if they're selling their apps is to make their story very clear, so that hey, this particular app, which serves some good functional purposes and is well reviewed, is also made by this really interesting solo programmer dude in Zurich, and he's living by this, and he's got a cat and a kid, and seems like a nice guy, and so yeah, why not? I'll buy his app, okay? It's that in a sense there is a digital artisanal kind of element there. Brands that are able to show the process of their making and get people engaged with it, where they're projecting artisanal or crafted properties, have a huge advantage here, okay? But very often they forget to tell their story. Because one of the critical things is that the better made product, the better the product is, the better made it is, the more refined it is, often the simpler it looks. Like so many things, it's like a good swimmer makes swimming look easy. When a product is very well done, we don't see the signs of the struggle, okay? So actually revealing through, for example, digital media, the nature and the making of the product allows a greater sense of customers' appreciation of what goes into making it. Literally, what goes into this, effort-wise, materiality, and all the rest of it, and therefore preparedness to pay a higher price. So, of course, the product attributes themselves must mirror those story, okay? It has to have the resolution that you're trying to show to customers. So the material, the form, the function, the aesthetics all must cohere. So brand narratives are a really powerful resource for consumer engagement. They're generally not accidental. Good products rarely sell themselves, unfortunately, because they're not readily understandable. Even if they function well, the effort that's gone on into them is not readily understandable. So, of course, you have to get out there and communicate value. In each culture, it's going to be a little bit different how you do this. So it's partly about communicating the functionality of the product, partly about giving a message to an audience in a way that it will respond well to. This is actually an advertisement here for a Peugeot, a French car. It's a few years old now, but I snapped this picture in Italy. And it's a small car with sliding doors. Now, in small towns in Italy, where the old streets of these medieval towns and cities are very, very narrow, sliding doors are hugely convenient. Okay, like in Japanese car parks, we know this, opening doors are really difficult to get in and out. And so there's a very clear value proposition there, but they've gone further. They're obviously pitching it largely to women. And the Italian there, which is somewhat obscured, translates as a simple car for a complicated woman. Okay, and Italian women enjoy being complicated. Okay, that has implications in Japanese like kimuzukashi and no chotto wagamama and chotto no difficult to kind of deal with, and that's fine. Okay, in the Italian context, so you can be a prima donna and whatnot. But you want to have, you want to have your passage through your day finessed, okay, while you're also being elegant as well. So strong brands, I think we all understand, have pulling power. Okay, they create demand for product. Okay, so consumers will demand renowned products from retailers. If you go along to Bic or Yodobashi fully intending to buy an Apple computer, you're very unlikely to be persuaded by a salesperson to buy a Windows PC instead. Okay, this is also why Apple scarcely discounts their products at all to their retailers. In fact, they don't. So that if you go to Bic and you buy an Apple device, they will give you only, say, 2% points, unlike most products where the brands are not strong, where, say, Bic will give you 10% points, just simply because Apple will not discount through their retail channels, even large volume retail channels, because their brand is just so incredibly strong. Okay. Apple will make you wait because you will wait. Okay, it's very clear that the quickest way to get an Apple product is to go to the Apple Store online and buy it. Even the face-to-face Apple Store is kind of limited, and half the time you go in there and you're directed to the store online. So they have taken complete control of the distribution, and they can do that because their brand is incredibly strong. Okay, so this is massively empowers the brand owner. You don't need expensive sales teams or product placement strategies. Brands that are not very strong often have expensive sales teams who are pounding the pavement, going out there, begging retailers, for example, to stock their product. So in terms of tales of origin and place, we see this often with Lux, Cartier, jewelers here since 1847. Okay, this gives a very firm, it gives a focus to the firm and communicates value to the customers. But anyway, so brands have a very clear strategic choice. Companies can with their product. They either tend to go for standardized goods at lower prices in large volumes, or they go for product differentiation. And that depends on product attributes, product stories, being different, and selling in smaller volumes typically. And the implication here is you normally have to get customers to pay a higher price for that because you don't have the economies of scale. It is difficult to achieve both. A quick point to note is that in traditional industries, the firm's name was the brand, and it was clearly embodied, obviously symbolically as well, traditionally in Japanese traditional industries, and it very often then grew from the company name to be a product brand as well in a whole range of cases. But at the same time, we see brand portfolios. This is multiple brands owned by one company. Sometimes this is organic. They create new products, new brands. Sometimes they do this through acquisition. Sometimes it's a bit of both. Luxottica, the largest glasses frame manufacturer in the world. These are not Luxottica. These are Moscot, which is a very distinct family-owned business. But so many brands that you recognize that were once independent companies have been brought into the Luxottica group, because Luxottica's great strength is in their manufacturing, their quality control, their sales, their distribution. And so they do so many brand extension products under license. As I list here, top fashion brands that when they move into sunglasses, the accessory business, extending their brand, they go to Luxottica and do a licensing arrangement. A company that has been very much a commodity based on producer that had effectively a pricing strategy, fast retailing, which owns Uniqlo, have also gone for, at the same time, certain premium brands as well that they've picked up through acquisition primarily, thinking there are some synergies between the two. So, for example, Fast Retailing owns Theory and Helmut Lang. Effectively, what we see is a segmentation strategy that firms identify and respond to differences within a general market. There are some people who will pay 30,000 yen for a pair of jeans. There are lots of people who don't want to pay more than 3,000 yen for a pair of jeans. Okay, and as a consequence, there are different segments in the market, different levels of price sensitiveness, orientation to quality, for example. And sometimes, even if the quality is kind of close, people just want something that's differentiated. They just want something that's, although functionally may be the same, design-wise, stylistically, they want something that is unusual. They want a signature piece, okay? A point of differentiation. And of course, customers are often mixing and matching. There's a lot of people who buy their basics at Muji, at Uniqlo, and then mix them with signature design pieces as well that express their own character, their own tastes. And another important point is that you can have exactly the same product, exactly the same brand, but the different people in the market will put different values on that. What that means is that some people will be so keen to have it when, for example, a new update comes out. Other people are prepared to wait because they're less committed to it, and so they're prepared to wait for the product to be on a sale or even secondhand, for example. So this leads to various tactics by companies to bring out different versions to respond to the different price points to try and maximize revenue. You see this, for example, really hardcore fans of a band buying merchandise bundled in with, say, the release of some new music and maybe the concert experience, often through things like fan club practices and whatnot. You can create premium versions that the really committed customers will pay a higher price for. So effectively what we need is what we call product positioning. You need to target each segment appropriately to maximize total profitability. This often means that it makes sense for companies to not compete in some segments. Okay. Now, reasons for that: there might be intense competition, low profit margins, maybe technological prowess. They're not particularly strong in a certain segment, and so they don't want to risk their brand by not being able to deliver on, say, the quality or the brand experience that one might hope. So in this fundamental sense, strategy becomes what you choose not to do. I think many of you will understand this, okay? You have this yourselves, okay? You're making hard-headed decisions about where you will direct your energies or not direct your energies. So the goal is so often in business to think about your USP, your unique selling proposition, okay? You need to understand your market position or your potential market position and find a segment in which you can offer a distinctive value proposition. This is the goal. Ideally, find a category to be number one in, okay? Sometimes this is about discovering a latent category, finding an area where you can add more value than competitors in the market, but then actually going through a bit of a process of educating customers to the value that is. In a sense, expanding customers' horizons, expanding the range of what they value, telling a story about what you do and why customers should value it. For example, becoming people more, helping customers to become more design-centered. Functional attributes of the product, say, of a Toyota might be extraordinarily persuasive relative to your own product, but you may have the edge in design. So perhaps this is about, to some degree, nudging consumers toward a great appreciation of the aesthetics of the product category. Don't just buy a car based on functionality. Hey, all cars are pretty reliable these days, but if you're going to be in Tokyo where you're never far away from help if the car breaks down anyway, looking good may be a far more important thing. And, think twice. Don't buy an ugly car, okay? Okay, reliable car is good, but do you want reliable and ugly? Okay, get reliable and attractive. Oh, and we're more attractive, okay? If, in fact, that is where you think you have a distinctive competence. Okay, And there's a very important point here. It's really difficult to convince people that they've been wrong. People don't want to be told that they've got it wrong. Because it's not just that they got it wrong about something, their self-confidence about their ability to act wisely in their own interests. This is a kind of belief that's always a little bit fragile because we're making decisions all the time for ourselves. No one wants to feel like they're a sucker. No one, or that you've been a fool, because this is a generalizable set of implications. So it's not just, hey, you bought the wrong car. You're a dumbass, and something so fundamentally you got wrong. So if you got that wrong, maybe you married the wrong person, maybe you bought the wrong house, maybe you went to the wrong university, maybe that shirt you're wearing you think it's good, but actually it's ugly. So it becomes very corrosive, a lack of self-confidence in your own judgment. So trying to tell people they got things wrong is not the way to encourage an emotional engagement with your product or your brand, or just to get people listening to you. People tend to get very, very defensive. So the implication here is instead that what you want to do is expand the horizons of a customer's concern. Get them to expand, in a sense, the things that they care about. Add that extra thing that you can do better than the others, better than the supplier of whatever product they bought last time rather than yours. And moreover, not just add that concern, but lead them to value that concern over what was the unique selling proposition of your competitor that won their attention last time round. So one of the biggest dilemmas is when you do have a strong brand, you've got to preserve it. And one of the biggest dangers in terms of preserving your brand is yourself and getting greedy. Because if people like your product, you're very tempted to, particularly if it's a brand, kind of a luxe brand, for example, to start putting on a lot of things to engage in what we call brand extension. And I've made a separate video where I'm kind of playing with ideas of what Waseda could do in terms of brand extension. Okay, there is a case here, Dolce & Gabbana, D&G, quite an exclusive Italian fashion brand. It was a bit edgy, and with brand extension, they did a lot of belt buckles, for example. And a lot of people who couldn't buy most of the Dolce & Gabbana product bought the entry-level kind of product, the belt buckles. And to be blunt, it took on sort of negative associations in some markets, such as France and whatnot. In fact, people would quip in some contexts. If you see a D&G buckle, you see a drug dealer. That's just not the way you want your brand to be associated. So this is a fundamental problem. You can lose control of your brand and its brand identity if you just kind of put it out there, and you are putting it out there because you can't just decide who you're going to sell this to or not sell this to. Universities are in this interesting position when we make a decision, when we're in a privileged position, when we can choose about who we admit and who we don't admit. So part of it is, well, do we kind of want this person representing us? Okay. Well, with blind entrance exams, in the interest of fairness, we actually don't do that. But in institutions that have had admission interviews, for example, that has been part of the thing. Do we want this person representing us? This is an issue when you're hiring people. Well, when you put your brand out in the market, you can lose control of it. Price can be one filter, but sometimes there are some wealthy people out there who maybe don't bring the necessary dignity or gravity associated with your brand. So this is a problem with luxe brands in general. That gangsters, the footballers' wives and girlfriends, pejorative kind of reference, that people who have money but don't necessarily have, the class you would like your brand to be associated with, can present you very significant branding challenges. Okay? So we can see so many brand examples. I talk about them in a video, for example, Onitsuka Tiger, very famous for shoes, and have extended to some other products in a limited way. Todd's extended into handbags, again, very famous for shoes. It makes sense. If you go too far, then people may just get simply sick of seeing the brand. And I would suggest that this has been the problem with Supreme, that they very much developed a business model where they created constant buzz by dropping new products regularly under the Supreme brand. But eventually, what has Supreme become? Supreme has become stickers that you can kind of brand extend anything with, okay? To a remarkable number of university students, have a Supreme sticker on their Apple laptop, for example, which is on the one hand very clever for Supreme. It gives them a lot of brand profile. But there is the problem that people may get sick of seeing it. It may become a cliche. So you certainly don't see Louis Vuitton selling stickers, for example, okay? And you don't see them discounting. And the CEO of LVMH has been very, very clear on this, that you won't see our product on a sale. So very selective also about their distribution channels. When you start licensing your product and whatnot, this presents even more complexities, because the licensees might do things with your brand that you wouldn't choose to do yourself, diminishing the quality of it. So licensing arrangements are normally wrapped in very tight legal restrictions about what can and can't be done with the brand. Now, if you're in the process of creating a brand, do start off optimistic, okay? When you're making decisions about things like naming and whatnot, there is lock-in. The worst thing you can do is to create a brand, for example, with a naming that either culturally doesn't carry across very well, like this one. I'm not even going to get into why this is not a good one in English. But really basic things like, if you can't get the .com or the relevant URL, if you can't actually get the trademark protection that you want in other countries, because the brand is being associated already with other businesses, then you've got a serious problem. My very firm advice is, before you create a brand, just get on a domain name registration website, any of them, register.com or one directnic.com, or there's so many of them, and just go looking. My own view is, if you can't get the .com or some other catchy take on your brand around the .com, don't do it. You must be able to have the most basic digital presence there, because in many ways, whether you can get the domain name is a good proxy measure for whether other people have already thought of using this name. Anywhere in the world can register the domain name. And so you would think that if someone's already gone and started to build a brand presence, then they would have also gone after the .com. So use that as a starting point. And if you come up with a clever name and the .com is available, it's kind of like winning the lottery these days. So a little bit on advertising. Of course, digital communications has dramatically changed the landscape. Okay. There's so many more ways in which you can target consumers directly through still paid media. Okay. Effectively, what you're doing is you're buying attention now. Traditionally, it's been analog, whether it's billboards or places in newspapers or spot advertisements or whatever. More and more, that's obviously digital platforms. Okay. Now, historically, before you could target customers as you can digitally, effectively it was very much broad-based communications. A television commercial, of course, was for everybody. And so there are lots of businesses which never paid for television advertising. This is an interesting thing. You go into a country town and you see tractors advertised. You don't see tractors advertised in a city. Okay, the advertising is too expensive. In a country town, the advertising is cheaper, and there's also more people likely to buy a tractor. So that might actually, make sense. Okay. So digital advertising leads to the promise of more targeted marketing, more targeted advertising, directly communicating to people, and so that's the promise there. We see very often that there is bought attention, paid digital promotions that may not look like advertisements, but nonetheless is bought media, or at least bought attention. Paying influencers, for example, to endorse products is a classic example. And of course, if it's a simple transaction based on a number of followers someone has, and then the question of the market fit between the brand and the followers of the particular influencer, for example. So, of course, it's much bigger than paid promotions, and the holy grail really for branding is to not have to go out and buy attention at all, okay? That you can earn attention. And Elon Musk and his persona, what he's done with Tesla, is a very substantial example of this. You know, Tesla doesn't need to go out there and heavily advertise for the very simple reason that Elon Musk has just got the brand so much attention in the first place. Now, of course, you still have to tell people you're out there and where they can find you, and you can do a whole bunch of interesting things to do this. One of the things that many companies are trying to do now is more viral branding, okay? So to get consumers to share stories about your business, your brand, your products. So the product has to be right in the first place. You have to have some customers that really engage with you, find value, and are prepared to do this, okay, because they're effectively mixing their own reputation with yours. So that becomes a critical planning parameter. Do you want to project your brand in such a way that other people really feel that their own stature is enhanced by being associated with it, by recommending it, rather than the risk of it being diminished, for example? Now, the public relations function for companies is very much about promoting the firm in addition to the brands, and sometimes only that. It may be directly communicating to investors, so it becomes investor relations. It may be relating to a problem with the company, maybe dealing with journalists, the media, again, potentially investors, government regulators, for example. So this can be, crisis communications. Dealing day to day with governments, this is very significant in some industries. So dealing with regulators, dealing with policymakers, if you're in the airline business, for example, you're constantly having to get permissions, and of course it's not just safety issues and whatnot. In the Japanese case, airlines, flights, they have to be regulated, and even technically prices have to be, I think that's been now somewhat deregulated, but prices have been put in the market were technically subject to approval by authorities. So more and more there's also a lot of concern about corporate social responsibility, so communicating to a lot of other stakeholders, activists, MPOs, and then MPOs that actually provide ratings. There are a whole bunch of rating agencies out there, or providing assessments, reports on companies about how environmentally sustainable their businesses practices are, for example, or many aspects of corporate social responsibility. And a critical thing, of course, is that when you're in a world of earned attention, pretty much everything is in competition with you. It's not just a rival car company. For example, if you're Toyota or Nissan or Honda releases something new, yes, in the auto media and amongst immediate car buyers, then yeah, there will be some competition for attention there. But if you've got a planned event and you want to build, boost the profile of the company, and then something overshadows that, some other big development, then that's the problem. Sometimes companies make very strategic investments in, for example, being sponsors of events, Olympic sponsors, and then circumstances overtake them. And one of the dilemmas, for example, of companies that have been sponsors of the Olympics when the Olympics was deferred, and there's widespread doubt about the wisdom of hosting the Olympics in the middle of the COVID pandemic, was this notion that maybe it's not actually such a good thing to be associated as a sponsor with the Olympics when you're paying all of this money. And if a lot of people think the Olympics shouldn't be going ahead, maybe there is not a positive reputational advantage to the firm for this. So there are a lot of things that can mess up with the calculus of attention, whether it's bought attention or earned attention. So in a nutshell, we live in a era of ubiquitous branding. Brands pattern our urban and virtual space. Tokyo, of course, has been like this for decades, but digitally, you know, the we are constantly bombarded by this as well. It's everywhere, and of course, people reflect brands. It's partly reference the fact that the brand's reflected here in the car passing by. But people become brands on social media. Your digital profile, you are effectively a brand, and so you have to be alert to your own brand positioning. Okay, your brand equity, how it can be diminished through a faux pas, a false step in digital space. So you need to be very careful in managing your own brand, particularly because things that are out there digital are not necessarily eternal, but very long lived, very searchable. Okay, so we all need to be brand managers, if for nobody other than ourselves.